Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm sure that, like me, you were appalled when you saw the terrible images from Moscow last night. People being shot dead in a concert hall. I also was struck by the terrible sight of the concert hall burning down. The concert hall being engulfed in flames. The concert hall being engulfed in flames, having been set alight by the terrorists who threw Molotov cocktails. And as I watched these terrible scenes, I was reminded of a scene in Dostoevsky's novel, The Devils, Biesi, which describes a similar scene of nihilistic violence. And there's a famous moment where one of the characters watches a public building being burnt down. And he says, "What's that fellow doing on the roof? Tell him to come down." And another man replies, "Well, the man on the roof, he's trying to put out the fire." And the character says, "But they have lit a fire in the minds of men which will never be put out. They have lit a fire in the minds of men which will never be put out." This was Dostoevsky's way of expressing the horror of nihilism, nihilistic destruction. Well, oddly enough, in 2004, George W. Bush, the American president, indirectly quoted this very passage of Dostoevsky, denouncing nihilism, when he said this. He said, "We have lit a fire which warms those who feel its power and burns those who stand in the way of its progress." We have lit a fire which warms those who feel its power and burns those who stand in the way of its progress. What George Bush meant was that this thing which Dostoevsky had denounced as nihilism, he was in fact announcing it as the cornerstone of American foreign policy. Nihilism has become, in the mouth of George Bush, the cornerstone, the guiding principle of foreign policy. George Bush, who also said, according to Bob Woodward, "We will export death and violence to the four quarters of the earth in defense of our great nation." Now, I mentioned George Bush not just because of the fire image which he uses in his speeches, but also because it was, of course, under George Bush's presidency that the 2004 Orange Revolution took place, largely instigated by the National Endowment of Democracy, by the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. The Orange Revolution, which interfered in the Ukrainian elections and brought to power a man whose wife worked in the White House. George Bush was also the president who, in 2008, encouraged and obtained the agreement to offer NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia. In other words, we have to go back to George Bush's presidency. Everybody remembers George Bush for the invasion of Afghanistan and for the invasion of Iraq, but they forget that he was also at the origin of these two key dates, 2004 and 2008, which are the trigger, 20 years later, for the war that we are now experiencing. We ran a piece on FVDinternational.com a couple of weeks ago in which Václav Klaus, the former Czech president, made a very interesting revelation. He said that at the NATO meeting in 2008, the European leaders had protested, but that the British and Americans had insisted and got their way. How things have changed. Today, the European leaders are the attack dogs. The European Commission, the High Representative, many national leaders. We've all heard Emmanuel Macron's remarks. They are now the attack dogs. They are the people who have just signed, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Britain, Denmark, have all just signed 10-year security agreements with Ukraine so that this war will continue for another 10 years. It's already lasted 20 years if you start counting in 2004. That makes it a 30 years war, the 30 years war from 1618 to 1648, which ravaged Europe. And I have to say, although I shouldn't really say this, not being a Dutch national, But in a way, Mark Rutter is the worst of all of them. And I say that for a specific reason, and that is that Mark Rutter has said something, and in fact he said it twice. He said it first in January 2023, and he said it again last week. He has said something which no other European leader has said. He said, if we don't beat Russia in Ukraine, Putin will come further west and the whole of Europe will be under threat. That's been said by many other European leaders. But he then added something. He said, if Putin, as he puts it, if Russia conquers the whole of Europe, all right, in his fantasies, then America's security will be threatened. In other words, Rutter wants to fight the war in Ukraine, not to protect Europe, but to protect America. And when I listened to Thierry Baudet cross-examining Mark Rutter in the slaapkamer last week, you probably saw it. Thierry kept asking him, well, what about the Victoria Nuland conversation? What about the fact that the Americans instigated the Maidan coup? What about this? What about that? Rutter simply refused to reply. He replied in the same way as he replied when Thierry asked him about who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. Wat ein Unsinn. That's the only thing he said. And the fire image came back to me also at that point. Rutter reminded me of another literary figure, a 20th century literary figure. There's a Swiss playwright called Max Frisch, who wrote a wonderful play called Biedermann und die Brandstifter, Biedermann and the fire raisers, Biedermann and the arsonists. And that play tells the story of a rather weak man who lets rooms in his house in a city where there are arsonists, where there are people blowing up buildings all the time. And as the play progresses, we gradually realize that the tenants that this man Biedermann has let his rooms to are in fact themselves arsonists. And we see, as the spectators of the play, how he refuses to see the very reality that is under his nose. At one point in the play, he goes up to their room and he sees barrels of dynamite and fuses and things like that. And even then, he won't admit that the arsonists are in his own house. And then the final scene, the arsonists come down to the sitting room. They treat him very rudely and they order his servants around. And they say, at the final, literally the final scene, they say, "Excuse me, Mr. Biedermann, could you lend me some matches?" And Biedermann gives them the matches and then turns to his wife and says, "But if they were really arsonists, they would have matches, wouldn't they?" That is Mark Rutter. That is us in Europe. That is us in Europe. We have got the fire raisers in our house. They're the people who blew up the gas pipeline. They're the people who blew up the thing we depend on for our energy and for our warmth. We've not just got them in the house. We've thrown away the key and locked ourselves inside with them. So when people ask me about peace in Ukraine, as Thierry did, I think that, of course, there are things we have to do. We obviously have to hope that there'll be regime change in Kiev. We have to hope that the idea of neutrality will come back in on the table. We have to hope that we can liberate ourselves, us Europeans, from this crazy NATO prison. But I want instead, rather than talking about such banal things, or rather such concrete things, because they're not banal, to say that I'm very touched every time, and he did it again just now, when Thierry talks about die Partei van de Liefde, die Partei van de Vriendschap, die Partei van de Vrede. Because in a way, I think, the peace that we are aiming for can also be expressed, perhaps best expressed, in terms of poetry. And I'd like to end this with a few verses from a very well-known English hymn. It probably isn't known to you. It's extremely well known in England. We all love our own countries. We have guests here from France, from Sweden, from the United States. We all love our own countries. But there's another country I've heard of long ago, most dear to them that love her, most great to them that know. We may not count her armies, we may not see her king. Her fortress is a faithful heart, her pride is suffering. And soul by soul, and silently, her shining bounds increase, and her ways are ways of gentleness, and all her paths are peace. Thank you very much.